Downing Street says a full statutory inquiry into the Contaminated Blood Scandal will be overseen by the Cabinet Office. Theresa May announced earlier this year that an investigation would be held into the events of the 70s and 80s, which left at least 2,400 people dead in what was called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. The families of those affected had opposed any involvement by the Department of Health. Let's go and talk to Sue Threakall from Erdington, who sadly lost her husband Bob in this Contaminated Blood Scandal. Sue, evening to you.
Hi, Paul.
Thank you for joining me. Are you pleased the Department of Health won't be involved now then?
Oh, I'm absolutely delighted they won't be involved. I think it's a shame it's taken them nearly 3 months to do the right thing. But at least now they've apparently stepped back from it all. We might stand a chance of actually getting on with the inquiry and setting up the terms of reference and appointing a chair and so on. It
was a massive scandal. Just explain what happened, Sue, to your hubby, Bob.
OK, well, in a nutshell, Bob was a severe haemophiliac. Haemophilia is a condition whereby the blood lacks an essential protein that's necessary for clotting. And when he was young, there was no treatment at all, so it was basically the same sort of thing that you and I would do, rest, ice, and all the rest of it. Then a new treatment called cryoprecipitate came in, and he was okay on that. In the late 70s, they developed clotting concentrates, which meant that they pooled the blood of tens of thousands of donors, up to 60,000 donors, for each treatment. And we were urged by the World Health Organization in the early 70s to become self-sufficient in our own blood supply rather than importing blood and blood products from high-risk places such as America, where the prevalence of hepatitis was very, very high, and where they paid people to donate their blood. And money was set aside for that, and basically it was then diverted to other purposes. We've never actually found out what those other things were, and we have never become self-sufficient in our own blood and blood product supply. We're still not today. And so we imported vast amounts of plasma from America, and it was known to be infected. The warnings were there. We knew where they were getting it from. We knew that American haemophiliacs had been getting infected for 2 or 3 years before our men were, and yet nothing was done. No moves were made to protect the haemophiliacs in this country. In fact, quite the reverse. They decided to, quote, monitor the spread of AIDS into the UK, and the result was that 5,000-ish haemophiliacs in Britain, virtually a whole generation of haemophiliacs, became infected with hepatitis C, and out of that number, a quarter of them, 1,200 and something, were also co-infected with HIV. Out of that, we've already had over 2,000 deaths, including Bob.
And you've been waiting a long time to try and get any sort of justice. You and the family have had to live with this for decades.
Yeah, well, he died in 1991.
Yeah,
we've been campaigning ever since.
So what do you want? What's your ideal to come out of this inquiry?
Well, the ideal for me, first of all, is that they stop messing around now, and that the Cabinet Office really takes the ball by the horns and shows some determination to get this inquiry well underway. We need a chair appointed that we can have confidence in, and we need that done really quickly. My preference would be for a proper judicially led inquiry, so we've got a judge or a retired judge of some stature, because the legal complexities that are going to be brought forward at this inquiry really need someone that knows what they're doing. I would like to see him supported by a panel. That's where I could see someone like the ex-Bishop of Liverpool, who's been mediating throughout the last few months. I could see him having a role there. But we also need full victim involvement throughout, particularly in setting the terms of reference, because when the Department of Health were insisting on running it, they only wanted to deal with the period that covered the sort of lead up to the infections for the first couple of decades, I think it was. But we need it brought right up to the present day so that they can investigate the whole story, how these infections happened, what happened during particularly the AIDS crisis, and then how the victims and their families have been treated ever since. We've got a whole generation of children who've grown up without a father. Some of them have grown up orphaned because of it. They've never been taken into account by the government at all. Widows like myself have just been completely more or less ejected from any support now. It's caused horrendous anguish. It's caused mental health issues among people. People have committed suicide. People have lost their homes. It really needs dealing with right from the outset. What led up to these infections, what decisions were made that shouldn't have been made, and vice versa. Who allowed them to be made or not made? Why that happened, right up to the present day. And then following that, the victims need to be treated properly with some compassion and stop being treated like scroungers and having to go begging. Some of the men who are really very, very poorly are having to go begging for charities for help. It shouldn't be like this.
It's unbelievable what happened. Sue, I really appreciate you joining me. Let's hope that you get some sort of satisfaction and
can
and
I
some
just
justice.
say one more thing?
Yeah, please do.
I have heard a rumour today that the Cabinet Office, I assume it's them, are going to spend the next couple of months looking through the last consultation that was done by the Department of Health. Now, if that is so, that is a completely unnecessary move. It's outrageous that they should even consider doing that. We've waited nearly 40 years for this inquiry. They need to get on with it before we lose more people.
It's just going to delay the process.
Yeah,
Sue,
of course it is.
good luck to you. Thanks
Thank
for talking
you.
to me. Sue Threakall from Erdington, who lost her husband Bob in this contaminated blood scandal. Bob died in 1991.